would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right. Today I'm joined with cannabis coach, cultivator, fellow podcaster, and highly optimized human being, Ryan Sprague. Firstly, you were pointed out to me by a listener of my podcast, and she's like, you gotta get this guy Ryan Sprague on. So I went, I listened to your recent appearance on Aubrey Marcus, and yep, as soon as I finished listening, I'm like, yes, I do. So reached out to you immediately, and boom, here we are. For one, you have a powerful overall like positive energy that definitely comes through when you speak. But I also just love everything you're doing, from the coaching to the cultivation and farming practices. So we'll definitely get into all that. But with that being said, welcome. And yeah, before we get into it, is there anything else that you'd like to add about yourself or your background?
Thank you so much, Sky. I'm excited to be here, man. You know, podcasting is one of my favorite things. It's hard to pick a favorite thing. Like I thought about that recently because, it was funny. I was at someone's house and, they kept being like, oh, we're having this for dinner. I'm like, I love that. And then it was like, oh, we're doing this right now. I'm like, I love that too. And they were like, let me guess, you love this thing too. And so it's
Pretty
funny
much.
because I'm grateful enough to and lucky enough to be able to do a lot of stuff that I love. And so podcasting is one of those things, coaching, of course, cultivating cannabis and also cultivating food in general. I'm really big on organic soil science and being able to remediate the soil of the earth. And so, I think when it really comes down to it, that's why I made the business highly optimized, because I thought, I'm like, how do I capture all of this in a way that kind of describes all of it? And I think what I'm most passionate about in life is being highly optimized and teaching others and guiding others on how to do the same thing, whatever that means for them, because it might be different for each person. But in terms of like being optimized in your physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual planes of existence, I think is my ultimate thing.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. The regenerative farming and all of that is definitely something for me that I'm trying to develop a larger understanding of as well, because I think that's huge, especially now. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you see yourself this way, but you're a great speaker and communicator, and I don't know if
Oh, thanks, man.
this is something that's always been with you or what. So I did want to ask first, like, have you always had this skill, or did you have to develop it, or what's up with that?
It's a great question. And I think this is the first time I've been asked this. So thank you. And I think for me, the quick answer is no, for sure. And who knows, maybe it was, but I didn't believe it. And I think that like whatever we end up doing well in our lives, it's because we have a belief system based on the fact that we can do it well. And I think for me, that was a long time coming, because growing up with social anxiety and, again, like when I really think about it, it was just simply a feeling I was feeling, and I got diagnosed with this disease. And so therefore all of my experience of life started being framed and put through this, essentially limiting pattern of social anxiety. So when you get diagnosed with something like that at a younger age, I always had tons of friends. The version of anxiety I had, which, looking back in hindsight is kind of funny. I've compared this to other people where I've told them and they're like, no, you don't have anxiety. And I'm like, no, I really do. And they're like, well, you talk a lot. And I'm like, yeah, when I get anxious, I talk more. So that's why people, it kind of worked for my benefit in a way. So I've always had like a knack for talking, but I think the belief about being a good speaker that I could be was forthcoming, later in my life. And, it's funny because looking into human design, I'm a projector. So like literally it's like, oh, you use your voice for your power. And so learning that was like one level of like, okay. And I had already started the podcast, at least one podcast by that point, and I'd already started going through like my quote unquote awakening, which is such a cliche thing, but it's really what happened. And so like I had started pushing the envelope more, putting my voice out there, scared as hell about doing it, but just started realizing that, well, at the end of the day, no one, like, not everyone is ever going to like me. So at the end of the day, if I put my true voice out there and I speak from the heart, well, then hopefully I'll bring in certain people that are resonating with that message. And the people that don't, they'll find someone else whose message they resonate with. And so I started putting it through that framework. And when I did that, I noticed a big uptick in my ability to not only speak, but do so in a coherent manner that wasn't like anxiety provoked, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah, I have a pretty similar thing with not necessarily feeling naturally drawn towards like speaking publicly, but I
Yeah.
same thing. It's like you're not going to have everybody like you anyway. Might as well put yourself out there and draw the people that are going to be attracted to you, and that's just going to build, your own community for yourself. And so I can definitely resonate with you on that. I think that's awesome. And
Yeah.
yeah. So again, I think what you're doing is so important too in terms of, like the cannabis coaching, for example. And I think it's going to eventually become a big deal. And you're kind of like, at the foundation, kind of paving the way in that regard. You're one of the first. Now with like the legalization of cannabis becoming acceptable and on the societal level, largely, finally.
Mhm. Yeah.
It still is very new to many people though. And those who aren't so experienced with using cannabis, and even those who are, still may be missing out on like the infinite gifts and the potentialities that it has to offer them, when understood like from a larger, higher perspective,
Mhm.
and having like that reverence, and maybe talk a little bit about yourself and how your thinking kind of was maybe early in the early days, and how it kind of shifted or evolved over time personally with your own relationship with cannabis.
Yeah, I say often that right now, conscious cannabis is kind of like buying Bitcoin in 2011, where people are like, I don't know, is this a thing? Is it really a thing? And I really feel it's blowing up, slowly, but very surely. I mean, it's actually not really even slowly. I mean, just the feedback I've gotten since creating the program. When I created it, it came from a place of just like, I wanted to create this, and I didn't do any market research first. I kind of like burned all the sacred cows of creating a product where like you're supposed to go out, you're supposed to evaluate people, you're supposed to figure out if this is something people want. I didn't know any of that. So I just was like, I feel this coming through me. It's been my experience with cannabis over many years. And so I wanted to speak to that. And so when I created the program, I I would be careful to say I never expected the feedback I got, but it wasn't my first thought. I thought like, oh, this will take a while, but like then when people like Paul Check and Aubrey Marcus and stuff started resonating with us and being like, hey, what are you doing? It started to show me right away, like, okay, there is something here. If these people are interested in it, then it's only so long before the masses get interested in it. Because a lot of the times, like, podcasts are one of the ways in which people find information these days. Most people, at least in the realms of, I imagine, your listeners and my listeners, they're not watching the news, right? They learned a long time ago the news is actually the last thing you want to watch if you want to be in an empowered state of being. And so I think that a lot of the ways people find out about this stuff is through podcasts. And so for me, when I first started interacting with cannabis at 16 to help with my anxiety, which for a lot of people is like, what? It helped you with anxiety? Because a lot of people understand cannabis to bring forth anxiety in their own life. But by help, what I mean was that it actually helped me face it head on and realize that it was just something I was experiencing. It wasn't who I was. So I went from being socially anxious to experiencing social anxiety. And that like distinguishing thing was a big component for me because, again, if you take on the identity of someone who has social anxiety, then it becomes entrenched in everything you do versus like, oh, well, I have times in which I experience this feeling, which someone else called social anxiety, but I can just feel it as a sensation. And I can also understand that anxiety and excitement are really the same sensation, just with a different story put on it. And so cannabis helped me like really have the experience of all those things I was just speaking about, where I started realizing like, oh, I'm not actually my thoughts. I'm actually watching my thoughts go by, so I can't be thinking them. And so, like having those experiences at a young age, I didn't have the teachings at that point to back it up. That didn't come until later, but that experience alone was very powerful. But then, like many people, what happens with many people is that, especially with cannabis, unlike other plant medicines, it is able to be done on a more regular basis, right? Like you really don't eat a gram of mushrooms every day, right? You might microdose, but you're not going to like have an experience that you feel mushrooms every day. And so with cannabis, like many people, I had no idea how much was too much, what like a dependency pattern looked like, anything like that. So before you knew it, I was interacting with cannabis every day. And I wasn't doing so all day. I was never a wake and baker because I understood it just dulled my energy a lot. There would be the times where I'd be in nature and I'd interact in the morning or something, but I had lots of friends that were smoking all day, every day, but I was an everyday smoker for sure. And so I knew right away that like there was something deeper to what I was seeing cannabis as, as related to my friends, because they would interact with cannabis as kind of like a party drug, where I would interact with it and go watch Star Wars and just think for hours. And so I knew right away, I'm like, okay, there's something, but being that young, I had no idea how to place that. And so when I was 18, I went through my mortality crisis where I woke up one morning and I started peeing blood. I had no idea what was happening. It ended up just being a benign cyst that had broken up into my kidney. Luckily, it wasn't cancerous or anything like that. But it was my mortality crisis in the way of starting to realize that, like, hey, I'm not taking that good care of myself and my choices matter. And so on the way to the hospital, my father and I were chatting and he was like, are you doing drugs? Because that's like obviously what parents are going to ask when you're 18 and you start peeing blood. So I'm like, no, but I am interacting with a lot of cannabis. And so I saw him have a sigh of relief, which was interesting to me because he had never been someone who was like a proponent of plant medicines of any sort. But it was interesting because I'm like, oh, he must not be worried too much about cannabis. And we had talked about it, but it was never like, he was kind of just like, just say no, like the Nancy Reagan approach. And so basically what happened was when we were in the hospital, I started showing him a lot of the videos I'd been watching because I was starting to get like obsessed with cannabis. Like I was like, I want to know the science behind this. I want to know why I'm able, why it's able to help my anxiety. So I started showing a lot of these videos, one being Leaf from Dr. William Courtney, where he met this woman who had 11 autoimmune disorders. And through juicing raw cannabis leaves, aka no intoxicating effects whatsoever, he was able to put all 11 of those disorders into remission. And then they got married at the end. So it's a really cool video. It's from like 2011. And so, he was watching these and he's like, oh, I guess I didn't know what I didn't know. And he didn't have any cognitive dissonance. And so at that point, I just started getting into school for psychology because I was fascinated with the mind. And at the same time, about a year into that, I went to the Boston Freedom Rally, which is a big public display of disobedience where everyone comes out under the green and they interact with cannabis and the cops don't really bother you. And so I'm there and I hear this guy yelling, who wants to make butter with me? So I go over to his little canopy and he's passing out these flyers of a basic cannabis semester school starting in my house. And so I go home, I tell my dad, being a broke college student, I'm like, can you help me out with this? I really want to do this. Because at that point, I realized I didn't want to wear khakis the rest of my life. So I wasn't going to be a therapist. So I was like, what am I going to do? So he was like, yeah, I'll pay for it and I'll go with you. So he didn't interact with cannabis. He was just fascinated with this world. So we start going. I start learning about regenerative agriculture, all the ins and outs of cannabis. And at that point, things started to shift a little bit. But again, I had no guidance. I wasn't into any spiritual doctrines at that point. So I was kind of just guessing and thugging out and figuring it out as I went. And so it wasn't until about a 2-year period into that where I went to a music festival out in Las Vegas, interacted with MDMA for the first time, felt a big pull to my father, didn't know why. I figured, I'm like, oh, he likes gambling. Him and I were really close. He likes steakhouses. Me and my buddies are out here going to steakhouses. I'm like, oh, it must be that. I knew MDMA was a hard opener. So I'm like, oh, I must have missed my dad. So I come home and I found out that he recently got diagnosed with terminal cancer and that he only had 2 months to live. And I didn't actually know the 2 months to live part until later on, but he elected not to do treatment and he wasn't going to change the way he was living. He was a cigarette smoker. He was a Coca-Cola drinker. And so I had an opportunity in that moment to decide whether or not I was going to love my dad for the man he was, or I was going to try to change him into the way that I thought he should be because it wasn't supposed to happen like this. He wasn't supposed to die now. All of those coulda, shoulda, wouldas. But I realized I'm like, well, and it's not like I logically thought this, but I just had this feeling that kind of like, if I could put it into words, it was like, this is your one opportunity to have closure and make sure that you don't like have regrets the rest of your life about this. And so a couple of weeks in, he started experiencing pain. And so I started telling him about RSO, which we had both learned about at this cannabis school, because there were a lot of people there that were coming in to learn about cancer and RSO and cannabis. And so these people were coming in. they were showing their scans. Like literally, I saw their scans with tumors all over their body.
What is RSO?
Yeah, thank you for that. So it's Rick Simpson oil. And
Oh,
Rick Simpson is the gentleman who kind of brought this into the mainstream. But if people want to look up like a more quote unquote professional term, it's FICO, full extract cannabis oil. And there's lots of studies on PubMed now showing that THC can kill cancer cells, CBD can inhibit their growth. So for anyone listening who's like, I don't know about this, just go look it up. I know it's not in the mainstream, right? But these things do exist. And so I was seeing these people show up, seeing their scans, and then a series of months later, they're coming back and their scans are clear. And their doctors are like, what the hell is going on? I mean, these are really high ranking doctors too at Dana Farber and like some of the best cancer centers in the world. And it wasn't like cannabis was this magic pill. Like, I don't want people to think that, oh, you can just live any life you want and cannabis will just fix whatever, because that's not what happened. People were taking accountability of their life. They were getting their diet in order. They were sleeping better. They were doing all the things and adding cannabis into it. So it wasn't just cannabis, but it was a big proponent of it, because if you stop living if you stop giving into the aspects of your life that gave you the cancer to begin with, which in a lot of times are stress, both physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, and you start using this medicine that can stop the cancer where it is and start diminishing it, well, those two things put together can have some really serious and good effects. And so I started giving my dad this, and I had a feeling, I'm like, it might slow down his cancer, but I knew it wasn't going to go away with it because he wasn't going to change the way he was living, and I was fine with that. So I got an extra year with my father. And in that time, I started to find that him and I were able to speak about death and these really heavy subjects with a much lighter atmosphere about them. And I got to watch him have closure with his grandchildren, his other children, my mother and me, and his own mortality. And so it was at that point that my thinking around cannabis shifted, because I realized, like, whoa, I was able to connect with my father during his time of need and not view him as the sick guy. He got to keep his dignity and his hair, because he had a great head of hair. He didn't want to go chemo or anything like that. And so, like, that was when my shifting started to think. But again, I had not a lot of guidance around like what I was experiencing. I just knew I experienced it. And so then I got into the industry, worked there for 5 years as a patient care advocate and cultivator. And my dad and I were growing together at this time. So our last harvest we did together, I made in the RSO that helped him through that last year. And so it was a really profound experience of just like cannabis really connecting with me and me connecting with the plant, and being able to then connect deeper with the people in my life that I loved, including my dad. And so it was really interesting, because when I got into the industry, I realized that a lot of people didn't have this guidance, the same guidance that I had started to kind of figure out on my own. And so I spent about 5 years there helping people with holistic health and cannabis and all these things. But at a certain point, I realized, after a corporation took over our company that had different values that weren't in alignment with me, that I would need to go out on my own and do this. And so it was terrifying. But I had this awakening actually back in Las Vegas again, after I went to a cannabis convention and just did not find what I was looking for there in terms of the investors that would understand love grown cannabis and these kind of things. So I was like, what am I going to do? So I went home, and I realized during that experience that I had with MDMA again out in Las Vegas, that I was still interacting with cannabis unconsciously. There was like a deeper level to it. And so I took a 3-month break. And in that time, all of the things that I was numbing out with cannabis, aka this job I didn't want to be at, this feeling of being afraid of putting my voice out there, all of these things, all of a sudden, I just took action on them because I couldn't get away from them now. So I quit the job. I started Highly Optimized. I started the podcast. I did all this stuff. I started getting into coaching, brought all my psychological training back into the framework of my life. And so that was really where everything took off. And in that time, everything shifted with cannabis in a very fast manner. And once I started realizing that it wasn't the plant's fault that this happened to me, and I took ownership of my pattern with it, I started realizing, like, oh, I bet a lot of other people are living like this too, and they just don't know what they don't know. And so that's a pretty good trajectory of how my thinking has changed around cannabis over the last 12 years that I've been interacting with it, or 15 that I've been interacting with it.
wow. I'm glad I asked. That's actually a really beautiful story about, and sorry about that with your father, but that is beautiful that
Thanks,
you were
man.
able to have those great last moments with him. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
And then you did mention that topic of anxiety at the beginning, and that is something I was curious. I wanted to ask you about, and you kind of answered it a little bit. But yeah, some people, they say they get this experience of anxiety, and then other people feel like it alleviates the anxiety. And my initial thought is that it's kind of an assumption that it's partially biological, maybe partially strain dependent. And so I wanted to ask you,
Mm.
you're a lot more experienced with all this. So well, how do you feel about generally people that are experiencing the differences, is that something to do with it, like the biology and then the strains, or what would you say?
Yeah, so it's actually multifaceted. And I'm glad you asked this question because, a lot of people come to me and they're like, you said cannabis helps with your anxiety. It actually makes mine worse. And so, like, for me, I don't know exactly what allowed it to help right off the bat in terms of like the mechanism, but what I can say is that I was able to somehow believe that it was happening for me. And I think that's a huge aspect of how any plant medicine works, right? Like they will bring up shadow in you with the opportunity and the invitation for you to heal it. But if you hop into the victim mentality and you're like, oh my God, cannabis gave me anxiety, well, then you're actually externalizing your power because the plant, if it gave anxiety, it would give it to every single person that ever interacted with it ever. It would be objective in nature. But if we know that's not the case, then it begs the question of what subjective aspect of our lives is leading to us having anxiety when we interact with cannabis. And so there's a couple of different things here. Number one, I would say like the foundational level is how you're viewing your life. If you're taking ownership and you're aware that, like, for instance, like, hey, I had anxiety in me and cannabis actually brought it up so I could face it, that's like the first level. The other level is, and actually, this is kind of the same thing, it acts like a mirror, right? So it'll mirror back your internal state of reality without your ego and protection mechanisms preventing you from seeing it. Because that's what the ego is there to do. It's there to protect you, it's there to like kind of hide things from you. But at the same time, a lot of times it's working from this limited perspective where it thinks like we just hide the anxiety for him and it'll totally go away. But it's limited, so it doesn't really go away. It just starts coming out in all of these, different little things. Like, I feel like I need to work out 3 times a day every day. I feel like I need to smoke cigarettes. I feel like I need to drink a beer after work. I feel like I need to smoke a joint after work, right? Like it comes out in that way. But I think the other level to this too, which is a little more qualitative in nature, that not a lot of people are talking about right now. I think I'm one of the only people speaking to this level of it, is that a lot of the cannabis that's being grown right now and has been being grown for, I mean, at least the last 100 years since it's been demonized, is traumatized. And so just like how if we eat factory farm meat, we're interacting with stressed out meat that then is uploading that stress into us. If we are interacting with cannabis that was grown by someone who was in an anxious state, a depressed state, a frustrated state, whatever, their energy gets uploaded into that. And so if we're not aware enough to understand and separate ourselves and go, oh, that's actually not mine, then we can take on that energy. And then what usually happens is because we don't want to face it, we go, cannabis made me this way. And then we get nervous to interact with cannabis in the future. But, shamanic cultures understand that when someone grows a plant and then someone interacts with that plant, whether it's psychedelic or not, they're interacting with the level of consciousness of the individual who cultivated that plant. And I think that's one of the missing components that shamanism knows perfectly. But we know in today's world, we live in a world of scientific materialism where shamanism is kind of woo woo to most people. And so I think there's still a little bit of time until that's taken on as a universal concept. But that is kind of like the multifaceted aspect of anxiety that I've seen with cannabis.
Yeah, and I think this is where you kind of stand out among others in this regard. And that's one of the things I really respect about you and how you care so much about the plants and you're cultivating. And, as a large part of your expertise, it revolves around the cultivation process and no, not just cash crop style cultivating to produce maximum yields or anything, but like, serious quality and care approach. So please, yeah, talk to me a little bit about your overall like approach to cultivating cannabis and some of the methodology behind the magic.
Yeah, man, great question. So, and thank you for the kind words too. And, I think that when I look at cultivating cannabis, I look at it like a sacred relationship. So the same way that if you're dating someone, right, like you want to be able to like make them dinner, you want to be able to romance them, you want to be able to like, show them that you care about them. Well, when you're growing cannabis as a cash crop, right, like essentially it doesn't even have a name. It's almost like slavery in a strange way. And I don't mean to make that comparison because I understand that might be a trigger for someone, but like take the idea with a grain of salt here that like when you're cultivating a bunch of sacred plants and you're doing so without being able to give them individual care, and you're only like really objective is like how cheap can I grow these and how much can I get off them, and like that's kind of your objective or goal, then essentially like the plants just kind of feel like left aside. And it's a feminine plant too, right? So like, it gets traumatized, it gets all these things. So for me, how I look at cannabis is like, okay, what is the way in which I can co-create with nature to be able to give like the best container possible to be able to hold space for this plant being grown? And so what I do is a mixture of no-till gardening, which essentially is just like creating, this beautiful soil. Then when I grow in, I'm not tilling it between each round. I'm actually just adding more worms into it. I'm adding more compost. I'm essentially creating a living ecosphere in my soil. And, I have mycelium in there. I have all of these different things that allow this soil to be a full soil food web. And, we joke a lot in the organic community of cannabis. And again, this applies to vegetables and everything else too, that we're not really cultivating a plant. We're cultivating the soil. And the soil is going to figure out how to cultivate the plant. So it's actually kind of this paradox in the way that I've had some really interesting ideas on when I'm deep in the cannabis realm,
Some
where I'm like,
ideas.
whoa, yeah, ideas, dude.
Love it.
And it's kind of like that moment where you're like, whoa, I'm not even cultivating a plant. I'm cultivating a soil. It's like mind blown, And so it's really cool because, I combine no-till gardening with something called Korean natural farming, which is essentially like if you are used to cultivating cannabis with bottled nutrients and you kind of like that aspect, but you want to move into organic, KNF can be a great substitute for that, because essentially what you're doing is you're creating this beautiful soil with a high microbe diversity. And then what you're doing is you're using KNF to create ferments, to create what I call, or not what I call, but what is referred to as IMO, indigenous microorganisms. So if you're cultivating outside, right? A lot of times when people get microbes, they buy what we call bugs in a jug. So they're kind of like, Mammoth P, Max Microbe, these things that I'm not against by any means. It's just that when you dose that to your land, depending on where those microbes are cultivated, a lot of them are not going to be able to exist in your climate. So they're going to die off and you're going to essentially waste a lot of money. So IMO is the process of going around where you live and creating collections of indigenous microorganisms, cultivating them and breeding them through a process of IMO, which is a 5-stage process where first you're cultivating and you're actually just like collecting the microbes in rice in this little box. And then you're actually combining it with brown sugar. Then you're going on to grain. And then there's like this whole process, right? So you're essentially building this, right? And so if you have a whole farm, right, you go all the way to IMO 5, then you can dose it around your whole land. And I call it the stem cells of the earth. So we know that with the stem cells, they take them out of your hip and they put them into like a tendon or something like that. So that's what we're doing, right? We're taking indigenous microorganisms from our area that we know will thrive in our area, and then we're collecting them, breeding them, and then putting them back into a concentrated aspect of our land. And so what happens is, all of a sudden, the microbes are what make the soil alive. They're what's turning the insoluble nutrients, which your plant can't uptake, into soluble nutrients. So like there's this whole beautiful symbiotic relationship going on. So like an example would be like the plant's roots put out these things called exudates, which are like these sugars. And so think about this in like a romantic relationship, right? Where these exudates are what the microbes want. And yet at the same time, the plant's like, well, I'm not just going to give them to you. You got to work for it. So right now I want nitrogen. And so the microbes are like, okay, they go out, they make, this insoluble nitrogen, the soluble nitrogen, they bring it back to the plant's roots. And the plant's like, all right, have some exudates. And so there's this like nice romantic relationship going on there. And it's beautiful. And the cool thing is that, terpenes are now becoming bigger in cannabis. And so terpenes are released as an immune response from the plant's roots being attacked essentially by microbes. And so the broader array of microbe diversity you have, the more terpene diversity you're going to get. And I'll get into why that's important in a second here. But, like essentially what I'm doing in addition to this, which is something that I think I might be the only one doing this with cannabis, maybe not now that it's been out there and I've been talking about it. I know of one farmer that's doing it in Sweden with hemp, but I'm using biogeometry in my gardens. So a big component of creating sacred space is making sure there's no interference. So the example or the analogy I give is almost like if you study for a math test, right? And the analogy for this would be like if you build a good soil, if you have your KNF, right? So you study for this math test and you walk into the school totally expecting to ace this test because you did your homework. But then you get there and you didn't know that someone was going to scream in your ear the entire time you were trying to do this test. Well, no matter how much you studied, how well are you going to be able to do? You're probably going to rush through that just to get the hell out of there. And so that's a lot of times what happens to our plants. Even if we've done the right proper, setup with our soil, with our KNF, we have these things called EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies. We have radio, we have to do all this stuff that's just like interfering, causing interference and like essentially noise in the plant's biofield and the plant's aura essentially. And so what biogeometry does, and this works for humans, of course, as well as what I did first and then applied it to my gardens to see, but what it does is it takes out all that interference. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting certain geometrical shapes and certain processes in there, such as like color balancing, rotating my plant and using a pendulum from biogeometry to see at what point it's testing highest for BG3. So all these like, interesting things that came through as ideas that I was like, okay, cool, I'll try that out. And, what I noticed was not only did my yields double, which I'm never worried about yield, but it was a quantifiable thing and a tangible thing. I go, whoa, that's something different. But also my terpene diversity got broader, and the experience of my plants was almost like, what analogy do I give to this? It's like, I could say it's like smoking biogeometry, but if someone doesn't know biogeometry, they wouldn't get that. So it's like the kind of experience I feel is like almost just a much calmer experience. It's almost like trying to go fishing on a day where the water is clear as glass versus when there's waves everywhere. That's kind of what I felt like, where almost like the plant is just so grateful that it got to like grow in an environment that was so balanced that it's like there's no tax to pay on it, right? There's no like uncomfortable feelings. It's just you're right there with it and you get to commune directly with the spirit. And so that's a little bit of what I'm doing when it comes to cannabis cultivation. And I said I was going to talk about that terpene diversity. I'll throw that in real quick. So for anyone listening who's like, I want to try some of this out right now, how do I experience something about what Ryan's saying? Well, one of the things I do that I've been doing for years just because I liked it was essentially making salads. And anyone who understands cannabis probably knows what a salad is, but I'll explain. So it's mixing different strains together. And the reason this is really powerful is that if you're interacting with a very energetic sativa, that can bring forth rapid heartbeat, which then can trigger an anxiety in you, right? Maybe you're nervous about your heart, who knows, right? But the only reason that's happening is because there's a high amount of delta 9 THC and a very low amount of other constituents such as CBD. So CBD will counteract the negative effects of THC. And so you have all these cannabinoids that are helping each other out. And so if you're combining like a high strength sativa with a hybrid with an indica, well, then on the indica side, you're getting like the physical trauma healing benefits from the body. On the hybrid side, you're getting the heart opening benefits. And on the sativa side, you're getting the mental stimulation, all the downloads, the insights, the awarenesses. So you mix those together, and now you have an extremely broad array of cannabinoids and terpenes, and you're less likely to experience that rapid heartbeat and things that can bring forth these things like anxiety. And so then you combine that with doing KNF and all these things, and you have 3 strains or maybe 5 or even 10 or as much as 30 I've done them with that have all these insane terpenes. And it's just this unbelievable experience. And this guy, Daniel McQueen, calls it the alchemy blend. It's really cool.
Oh, man, I absolutely love this. That's some next level stuff. I hope that people start to pick up on this. That's amazing. And I love that was actually one of my favorite episodes I listened to of your podcast. It was with you and another individual. I forgot his name, but you guys were getting into the Korean natural farming and all
Quinn.
that. Yeah, and,
Quinn Caliendo. The dude's
I
a
love
man,
it.
dude.
And then the biogeometry stuff, it's so cool, and it does make a lot of sense too. And like some more examples with the KNF. I think you were talking about like some fermented plant juices or something along those lines that you add as well. What are some other like interesting kind of maybe maintenance solutions or different things along those lines that you'd incorporate?
Scott, I don't know if anyone's told you this, but you ask great questions, man. Thank you for asking amazing questions, dude. I haven't been asked these questions before, so I'm so excited. So this is great because not only can I explain these things, but FPJ, fermented plant juice, and also FFJ, fermented fruit juice, are things that people can make at home. And the great part about KNF is that it's not only good for our garden, we can drink these things. It's really good for our gut as well. And so an FPJ is essentially taking a plant such as comfrey or cannabis leaves and combining with brown sugar and allowing it to ferment. And then you're actually straining it off and you have this like goopy substance that then provides like sugars and all these different enzymes and different, metabolites and things like that for the ecosystem of the soil. And again, like the more you're dosing your soil with living things, the more it's just like this beautiful community all living in harmony with one another. And so the great part about FPJ and FFJ is, like I said, people listening could try this at home. And so FFJ, you can make with, usually they say to make it with 3 different fruits. So like, for instance, you could do like, I think I have one right now that's peach, banana, and strawberry. And so what you'd be doing is you'd be taking those 3 constituents. And this is the same for the FPJ as well. You'd be doing it in a 1-to-1 ratio. So say you have like 300 grams of fruit. Well, you'd put 300 grams of brown sugar in there, and then you'd cut up the fruit a little bit. You don't want it like completely whole, but you also don't want it mashed up either. And then you'd put it there, and depending on the time of year, like in the summer, if it's really hot, you'll probably get it fully ready in about 5 to 6 days. If it's like the winter where you're at, it might take a little bit longer, up to like 10 days. But you'll notice if it's gone too far because it'll start smelling like alcohol.
Was that
And that's
outdoor or
when
indoor operation you're talking about?
you could do that indoor. Yeah, yep, you could do it indoor. That's usually what I recommend, just because, especially with like, well, really with either, because it's got the sugar in there, like insects will go for it. So I usually just keep them on my kitchen counter, and you'll start noticing like it's fun checking into them every day. And again, you can drink them. I mean, like, there's other things like OHN, which is a little more complicated. You're essentially like fermenting 5 different herbs, such as like garlic, ginger, etc. Separately, it takes months, and then you're combining them together. That one takes a little bit more time. But there's another one you can do called LAB, which is lactic acid bacteria, which is using like, rice, water, and a little bit of milk. And essentially, you can, like, as that ferments, you can scrape the curd off the top and like use it as dip for chips and things like that. And that one's really good to help with powdery mildew. So, like, a lot of people, have this challenge, especially if you're growing in the Pacific Northwest, because they have a lot of different strains of powdery mildew out there where they're like growing these amazing plants. And then right when the rainy season comes, they're all getting powdery mildew. Well, you can use LAB up to the day you harvest, because it's completely organic, to be able to stop that powdery mildew in its tracks. And so there's like so many cool things you can do. And this is stuff you can make for like pennies on the dollar, basically. So it's a great empowering thing. And there's lots of videos online if anyone's like, I want to dive into this. We're in the process of creating the Grow with Cannabis course, where we're going to tell you exactly what to do, but we're not going to really explain too much behind it, like on how to create it on your own, because for a lot of people it would just be overwhelming. So we're going to be creating offshoots in the future of like, okay, you want to dive fully into KNF and learn how to make it all, do this. But what I would tell people right now is you can hop on YouTube and look up a guy named Chris Trump. And he is like the leader of KNF. He's amazing. I did the 5-day intensive with him, which is where I learned it all. And he's got great instructional videos on there to learn more about it. But, for anyone listening, I mean, Grow with Cannabis is really going to be this answer for anyone who's like, okay, I want to know exactly what to do. I might have a very small space. I might have a bigger space. We're going to work with you guys to be able to figure out how to make your own soil, how to apply KNF. I have a great buddy, David Hoover, who makes all KNF inputs. So for people like myself, who at this point, I just don't really have the most time to make a lot of these more intense ones like OHN, and we didn't get into FFA or FAA rather, fish amino acids. It takes like almost a year to make. He sells those things so that anyone can be able to do this in the comfort of their own home. And I think that that's the one way that, number one, we ensure that we're not giving our money to these big chain dispensaries who do not care about cannabis and don't care about the sacredness of the plant. But also, we ensure that we have the proper medicine for us grown by us. Because the first thing we're doing in this course when we're planting is we're putting the seeds into our mouth to inoculate it with our microbiome. So the same way that a mother, when she's pregnant, starts singing to her baby, and her baby knows her mother's voice when it comes out, right? And when it's born, it's kind of like the same process for seeds, right? We're inoculated and telling it right away who we are. So then as it's growing, it's got our genetic code in it. And then when we actually grow this whole plant out, the whole idea of Grow with Cannabis is not just growing cannabis, but it's growing with cannabis. So what can you learn about growing? What can you learn about yourself while you're growing a plant? Right. So you learn it takes compassion, it takes care, it takes, consistency, it takes structure, it takes love, it takes all of the things that it takes to have a high quality life. And so we have all these weekly wisdom and contemplation practices in there, these energy practices, and also, of course, growing cannabis as well. So we're super excited for it.
Hell yes. Yeah, that's really cool that you mentioned that seed soaking too with your own saliva. That's something I had heard recently on these guys have this podcast. It's called Alpha Vedic. I think they're in somewhere in Northern California, but they're pretty into like biodynamic farming and things along those lines. So they're on the ball as well. That's cool to hear you say that too. And I've definitely noticed a difference personally in terms of cannabis, at least not necessarily that just grown in like my local environment or from friends growing it themselves versus stuff I would get at like the dispensary. And I don't know if it's drier, and I don't the way you're saying with the energy and all that. And there is definitely 100% noticeable difference. So yeah, and like I think a lot to do with too the local biology like you're talking about, and then the local the lighting as well, because something you're probably aware of too. There's a lot of research now with the light and how that becomes encoded within the food that we're growing and how that affects mitochondria and all that stuff. So You're on the ball, man. I love all of it. I could talk to you about the organic farming and stuff all day, but I know we're kind of pressed for time, so maybe I'll ask you a couple more questions. One that I want to ask you just out of curiosity, do you have any particular strains that you feel like you just really love? And if so, why? And yeah.
Yeah, dude, another great question, man. You're on a roll today with questions, man. I love these questions. So, what I would say is like, for me, when I cultivate strains, I'm not necessarily looking for like highest THC. If it happens that I end up having a high THC, cool. But, I'm usually looking for like what effect am I receiving and what's coming forth as the effect? Because I find that every single individual strain of cannabis, and even more so, every phenotype within that plant's genotype has a little bit of a different personality to it. And so for me, one of my favorite strains of all time is Tahiti Lime from Archive Seeds. It is absolutely fantastic. I think it's still sold out right now. Luckily, I bought another 10 pack before it sold out, but
Probably
it
partially
is,
due to you throwing
yeah,
it out
guilty as
there.
charged. You guys can blame me for that one. And it's beautiful, man. It's like a Skittles gelato lemon lime line cross. And I think they're calling the Skittles and gelato Moonbow now. So if you go on there, you'll see like it's Moonbow and lemon lime line. And that one is just like it's like sticking your face in a lemon peel. And you don't really smell a lot of cannabis like that these days. Everything is really myrcene dominant. People are like, really into the musky, the dirty smelling stuff, which I love too. I'm a big fan of like GMO and those kind of strains, but this is like an old school lemon G flavor. If you know, like the old school early 90s, like just lemon funk feel, it's got a little bit of sour diesel smell in there. It's really nice. And then the other company that I've really fallen in love recently, and I'll tell you why, is this company Keys to the Kingdom. They are amazing. And they reached out to me after I went on Aubrey. And, one of the things I've become aware of is that if you are looking to cultivate cannabis organically, well, most cannabis seeds being bred are not being done so in an organic environment. And so if you're then taking those seeds and cultivating them organically, it's going to take you quite a while, if ever, to be able to reach full genetic potential. And so if you are growing organically, it helps to purchase seeds that were bred in that organic environment. Well, not only is Keys to the Kingdom breeding in an organic environment, but they're also using KNF, they're using intention. I mean, like they got all the points covered. And I believe the guy who's the head of it, he's a famous breeder. I forget his name. It's Key something, but he was part of Gage Green Group. He's using a lot of ACE and Cannabinogen genetics, specifically ACE. I think Cannabinogen shut down, but ACE and Cannabinogen, the story that I've heard, and I don't know if this is accurate, but this part of it anyway, is that they were brothers or are brothers. But what they're doing is they're preserving landrace and heirloom genetics. Because again, there's like this.
Sorry, that's one thing that was going to be my last question. I wanted to ask you about landrace strains. Yeah,
Yeah.
please inform me about that.
Yeah. So basically, like, there's this challenge right now where everything's being so hybridized that like everything's very similar. And so, like, everyone's jumping on this Delta 9 THC train. They just want higher and higher amounts. And it's not because that's actually a good thing. It's just that's what they learned. We're living in a left brain dominant society that thinks, oh, more equals better. So therefore, if I have an option to buy a strain that has 25 or 35 for the same price, I'm going to buy 35 because that's ultimately going to be a better experience objectively, which just is not true. I mean, if you're looking to make RSO for a cancer patient or you have a lot of chronic pain, sure, Delta 9 THC might be the thing you want to go for. But for a lot of people, they just, again, they don't know what they don't know. And I would find a lot of these people when I worked at the dispensary and I would show them like, hey, try interacting with the strain at 15 to 20. And oftentimes they come back in and go, oh my goodness, I was able to like speak way better. I was able to articulate. I was able to like have a conversation. I was able to do all these things that I'm usually not able to do because I'm usually couch locked. And so a lot of the times, like that's what's going on. So these heirloom strains, they have very unique cannabinoids and terpenes that are not often seen in the hybridization world that we're living in with cannabis. And so ACE and Cannabinogen, I highly recommend anyone listening to check those out along with Keys to the Kingdom. And I do love Archive Seeds too. I don't know if they grow organically, but their Tahiti is amazing. And there was no problem reaching full genetic potential with that. But I think like, when I saw that Keys to the Kingdom was like, oh yeah, we're working with Zamaldelica, we're working with all these different strains, the Congo, Panama Red, all of these strains. It was like, whoa, that is something I'm interested in because immediately I know that guy's a connoisseur. He's looking for things that are very unique. It's kind of like if you're a wine drinker, well, you can drink wine because you want the effect of it, or you can explore wine because you really love the notes of it. And there's a deeper level to the effect. And I think that's one of the things that changes, when you're getting into using cannabis consciously with intention, is that usually it's a 2-level process where like you're interacting with cannabis to receive an effect. So 2 levels, interacting, effect. But what starts happening is you start realizing when you interact with it this way and you start communing with it as a spirit, that there's actually another level. And so there's actually 2 more levels. So what it happens first is interact with the plant, feel the effect, but then what comes forth as a result of the effect. So this differs from plant to plant. So one plant might give you more mental stimulation, aka downloads, awarenesses, etc. Like I was talking about with sativas. One might help you heal trauma in your physical body through like, breathing and things like that, more indica, right? So like what comes forth as a result of this effect. And then the final level is how do I integrate that? So how do I take what I learned from this experience and actually get the message? Because I think what a lot of people fail to understand with cannabis is that it yearns to be in a co-communicative relationship with us. But if we're not actually doing the work after the experience, well, then at best, we're just not communing with the plant. At worst, we're going to end up in a dependent cycle because we're going to think, well, I feel shitty. When I interact with cannabis, I feel better. Therefore, to feel better more often, I interact with more cannabis. As you can see how this kind of happens, it's not that they're waking up going, you know what I think will be great? Let's become dependent on cannabis. But they're just, again, they don't know what they don't know. But what the plant yearns to do is show you what's possible and necessary for you to move through, aka maybe anxiety, depression, whatever, to be able to have that high on your own supply throughout your sober reality as well. And then when you don't have that codependent relationship with cannabis, the plant will believe in you more as well and be able to show you more because the plant doesn't want to like give you anything that you can't handle. Now, again, if you eat a strong edible, it might just come out. But like if you show the plant, like, yeah, everyone's got an edible story. And so, like, if you show the plant, like, hey, I'm willing to do the work, well, the plant's like, all right, well, you're ready for the next lesson then. And so, like, there's this beautiful thing that comes out, this beautiful synergy between the communication that really only comes forth if you're willing to do that integration. And so that's why I'm such a big fan of that 4-step process. And so, for anyone listening, next time you interact with cannabis, and again, cannabis is not for everyone the same way psychedelics are not for everyone. I don't, I'm not a proponent for everyone using it. But if you're already using cannabis, you already find something you like with it, just try asking yourself, like, first of all, make an intention. And there's like a whole 3-step process I can bring you through that I have actually as a guide that I can give you for the show notes too, called the Conscious Cannabis Guide for anyone wanting to dive into this more. But start asking yourself, like, okay, I feel the effect. What's coming forth as a result of the effect? Do I feel relaxed? Am I getting an insight or download? Am I feeling something like, come through me in terms of physical trauma? Maybe you're yawning a lot, maybe you're burping, moving energy, like what is the result of this effect? And then you'll be able to find like, okay, that's why I like this strain more because this one produces these effects, which I like a lot. And then eventually you'll find like, 6 or 7 different strains that provide a cornucopia of different effects that work well for you at this time. And again, like they change from time to time, right? Like sometimes I'm more, leaning on like the mental stimulation. Sometimes I'm like, oh man, I've been facing some shadow stuff. I got to get into my body. But I think making those alchemy blends we talked about earlier too are really a good way to do it as well.
Hell yes. Well, yeah, man, you're doing amazing work, and shout out to those companies as well for preserving those strains.
Yeah,
Amen.
dude.
That's
It's
amazing.
huge.
Are there any last words that you want to put out there, maybe, or anything that you would like to see within the quote unquote cannabis industry, or maybe where you would like to see things go, or different things that you think would be cool for people to start incorporating into their cultivation process, or yeah, any last words in general before we sign off?
Yeah, I think my dream for the world of cannabis is a world in which people will start cultivating their own medicine to a degree where, let's face it, right? Money kind of runs the world right now. And so these bigger dispensaries have no reason to start cultivating this way because they're still making all the money. But if we start cultivating our own medicine and start taking money away from them, they'll start asking questions. And then we can tell them what we want and what kind of cannabis we want, and they will start doing it to be able to continue making money. And in the process, like they'll start actually caring more about the plant because you can't just start doing no-till gardening and KNF and all of this stuff and not actually start asking yourself, like, yeah, there's something deeper here, right? Like when you start communing more with nature, because again, in this 3D reality, I really feel that the earth is our God, right? And so, like, as you commune with nature, you start to understand yourself more. And so, like, what I really want to see is that, returning to how cannabis has been looked at for millennia before the last 100 years has been demonized. And I think we do that by first cultivating it in this sacred way, starting to understand and learn the teachings and wisdom the plant bestows onto us, and being able to take the money away from these big MSOs, aka multi-state organizations, that basically are the only reason they're in cannabis is because their projection sheet showed that cannabis was the thing to get into next to make money. They really have no place here. And so I really get excited about the idea of, more mom and pop stores, kind of like how craft beer came about, really similar with craft cannabis being a thing, because essentially, like, as a cultivator, if you're growing at home, you can only cultivate so many strains. But if you have a dispensary near you who's practicing intention, growing the right way, well, you might have access to 30 more strains and the ability to be like, what do I want to grow myself next? And so it works out well for everyone if we do it this way. But I think overall, I would like to see more people creating intention with cannabis, and not because it's like, you have to, because it's a plant medicine. I mean, that's part of it. But I think it's just because, like, we're missing a lot of what cannabis can offer us. And I think that in the world right now, we're seeing a world that is lacking in connection. I mean, that's the real epidemic going on right now. It's not loneliness, it's a lack of connection. Loneliness is just the result of that lack of connection. And so I think being able to commune with cannabis in this way is going to allow us to connect deeper with ourselves first. And as a result, because as within, so without, as above, so below, it's going to ripple out to the world around us. Healing begins and ends with us. And as we begin to heal ourselves, the world will begin to heal around us. Because again, as within, so without, as above, so below. And so I think that cannabis can be one of the best ways to allow us to remember how to heal ourselves, to remember how to, like, be our own gurus. And I think that the age of the guru is dead. Stop externalizing our power, start putting it back into the people. And I think that's why, I've heard Stephen Gray refer to cannabis this way, and I truly believe it too, where it is the people's plant. Because unlike things like ayahuasca or psilocybin or these things that are amazing, right, but a lot trickier to handle, they might send you out a lot farther. Cannabis is really the only plant I've found, maybe besides tobacco, but that works in a totally different way, to be able to get us more in touch with this feminine experience of just like being alive. The left brain, it's a great at, like, figuring out how to do math and these kind of things, but it's not good for, like, actually figuring out, like, our purpose, connecting to our heart, loving, being able to receive. And I think that, like, the world right now is yearning for more feminine energy. And I think that cannabis can be one of the ways that comes back. And so if I had to say it all in one, it'd be, creating more intention around how we interact with the plant and cultivate the plant, as a result, taking money away from these MSOs and hopefully initiating them to be like, okay, we'll fit with the times and we'll go with it. And being able to, start healing the world at large, because I think that if we don't start healing the world at large, who knows if there'll be a planet here for future generations to inhabit and have this experience we call life.
Sure. Amen to all of that. Wise words. Well, where would you direct people to find out more about yourself and your work?
Yeah. So the best place to find me is on Instagram at The Real Ryan Sprague. And my last name is spelled Sprague. I'm on there all the time. As you guys can tell, I love talking. So I love talking with people, hearing about their journeys and helping out where I can. We have the business Instagram too at highly.optimized. If you want to find out more about tips and tricks with cannabis, keep up on the podcast releases. I do have 2 podcasts as well. I have the Highly Optimized podcast, which showcases conscious leaders living a life beat of their own drum. It's essentially a hero's journey podcast. And then I have the This One Time on Psychedelics podcast, which I am super fired up about. It started about a year ago.
I'm gonna have
That
to
is
check that one
showcasing.
out.
Dude, it's awesome, man. You'll love it. And it showcases essentially the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place in the ever expanding world of plant medicines. We've had amazing people on there. Paul Check's been on there. I've got Josh Trent and Cal Callahan coming out soon. We just had Stephen Gray on. Just had Hamilton Souther on, who's a cannabis shaman in ayahuasquero. And it's really, really fun. And, I love that platform. And then if you want to hop into our free group, we have a Facebook group called the Ceremony Circle. That's actually what I'm doing right after I get off this call. So I'm hopping in there and I'm teaching people different cannabis techniques and modalities every week and open it up for a Q&A. Community is huge for me. So hop in there, start finding like-minded individuals who understand these kind of things that we can talk about tons of different stuff with. I mean, we talk about biogeometry, the nature of 369. I mean, the Fibonacci sequence, all this really cool stuff aside from cannabis in there too. And then if you guys are interested in doing the deep dive, I do have the Connect with Cannabis program, which is a 12-week certification program meant to train you in how to be able to go out and actually teach this stuff to others. You can also go through it just for yourself. We have a non-facilitation track as well, where you're learning the science and spirituality of cannabis. And really what it's meant to do is provide you with the frameworks and tools necessary to not only create a structure and discipline practice around cannabis, but to allow you to reimagine and have the direct experience of how cannabis can work as a powerful tool for self-awareness in your life. And so essentially it's like, being able to look at cannabis as a teacher in your life. And then we have the Grow with Cannabis program too, that's dropping this October that I'm super excited about. That one will be a self-paced course. And I think that is about it. I'm also doing these workshops. Recently, I just did one last night with my good buddy Christopher August. So if you're like looking for an experience, but you're not sure if you want to go into the program yet, we're doing these workshops called Cultivate Your Future, where we're joining cannabis and breath work together to bring you guys beautiful, beautiful experiences. And so hit me up, reach out. I love connecting, and you can find me there.
Excellent. Well, this was amazing. This is a blast. Definitely appreciate it. There's a lot more we can get into, so hopefully we'll do another one in the future at some point.
Yes, sir. You let me know.
Appreciate you once again. Thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you, Sky. You too, man.